As you say, I was thinking about patterns and the way that things that seem very random can suddenly come into view. And sometimes it seems like synchronicity, and sometimes it feels like there's a predetermined pattern. I mentioned in the poem the headlights on the Beltway, and I was thinking about research that's shown that people tend to cluster together when they're driving on expressways, and that's why you get weird slowdowns, because everyone sort of has this pack mentality and they group together. So it seems like a complete random scattering, but actually we're attracted to each other. Humans try to stay in packs, sort of like magnets and filings, right? So I was interested in thinking about when that's meaningful and when that's not meaningful, and how we try to read. Sometimes out of fear, we try to read more meaningfulness into patterns than actually exists. You know, this book, I finished it several years ago, and I sent it out to a number of contests, and it was actually a finalist in 3 contests that year, including the National Poetry Series, and I thought that was a great sign, but my life got really busy in other directions, and I just kind of put the manuscript away and didn't do anything with it for a few years. And then, let's see, when was this? Early 2016, I got a notice about Green Lantern Press running an open manuscript call, and I was getting on an airplane, and I thought, I have 15 minutes, I'll just send my manuscript off to this one place. And then, I don't know, a month later I heard from them, and they said they were interested in the book. My critical work and my poetry feed each other. I think I resisted recognizing that for some time. I thought they were different projects, but the further I went along, the more I realized how interconnected they've become for me. Which makes sense. You know, you get obsessed thinking about something. You have a series of problems that you're living with, questions you're trying to answer, and they just spill over into whatever mode you're working in. So my critical book, which just came out, is called News of War, Civilian Poetry, 1936 to 1945, and it's about the very same problem that's kind of the engine of my book of poems that's coming out. It's the question of the complexities and ethical problems of being a civilian witness, of watching things happen from a distance that our nation is engaged in, and that I am engaged in, am complicit with, but have no control over directly, like foreign wars. And I was especially thinking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in this particular book, and the way that news gets filtered back through the media, so that we get a kind of a partial glimpse of what's actually occurring. So this, in the critical book, is something that I thought about in terms of writers publishing in the 30s and 40s with regard to the Spanish Civil War and World War II. It's a comparative book, so I look at authors writing in Spanish and French and English. But that book was very much spurred by a very personal set of questions, really, regarding how to write about the wars that we engaged in after 9/11. I felt like I and many of my friends were looking for a way to write about these wars and about the violence that our nation was engaged in. And so I kind of went back looking for historical precedents in a way, trying to see how others had dealt with those questions. There's a strong sense of not having an ethical footing from which to write when you haven't experienced something with your own body, right, or seen it with your own eyes. So how do you put that at center stage in a poem? That was really, I think I had to work through that question in my critical book in some ways in order to permit me to write some of the poems in the book, and vice versa. Sometimes the experience of writing the poems helped me see with fresh eyes what some of the poets I was writing about from the 30s and 40s were thinking about, or some techniques, or I found myself responding to their poems in certain ways. There's a series of poems in Elevated Threat Level that are written as faits divers, which is a French term for a small news item. And I have a chapter in the book about a French poet who uses that very, very brief, very succinct, kind of pointed news item as a way to talk about things that happened during the occupation of France and other things. So there's a series of those in my book of poems as well. That's probably the through line of the book in some ways, is that kind of ethical conundrum of trying to write poems about things that I haven't witnessed myself, but that concern me deeply.